just do that on my code and I can send it to you. Sometimes people help from recording these conversations. Okay, I'm recording and I'll send you the link.
Great.
Okay, so now, all right, so we have the clusterfuck that in retrospect coming out of the Enlightenment gap, okay? The systems failed to solve the problem. And eventually we're going to get the postmodern critique that says, yeah, there's no grand narrative here and people use it for power. So be doubly skeptical. Okay. And then postmodernism then runs through the humanities and social sciences.
Right.
So now anthropology and sociology, I mean, they're just absorbed by that fucking thing. Everything's critique. Right. But of course that great, really important. And you eat your own fucking tail because you're not standing on anything.
Yep.
I mean, it's just sort of like, on what grounds are you critiquing? And eventually then you either sit on the sidelines and critique or start to become the damn power, which you then say is illegitimate.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, that's why I just came from, 4-hour diversity trainings all this week. The whole university is like, oh God, we got to worry about racism and all this other shit. And I'm like, okay, but you say, hey, we really are open to ideas. You're not open to any critique of this at all. And you say diversity, and you mean social justice and equity that corresponds to
very particular interpretation of those words.
It's this. I mean, and I go crazy because my heart's totally leftist. I'm always trying to help people on the bottom and do marginalized people. That's what I do as a clinician. But then I'm like, but I'm also ideologically coherent, and I'm worried that if you do stupid ideologies that actually are shallow, you're going to fuck this up and create totalitarian systems that actually can't be open to critique and evolve. And that's what they're doing, and that's going to ultimately bite them in the ass or bite us all in the ass, because the white identitarians, of course, are going to flip it out and everybody's going to go fucking insane.
No, it's so serious that, and I feel the same way, in the sense of, of course, being understanding from the starting point, especially, but then also witnessing this self-cannibalizing process to the point where once you get to the point where, I mean, there's already reasons why the academy shunned authentic philosophy, but now it's at a level to where, with slightly different reasoning, where it's like, all right, well, I guess we have to move on from this kind of institution at this point and try to move on.
Because the sensibility this is the, Jordan Hall rightfully calls it the blue church. Eric Weinstein identifies as a distributed idea suppression complex. And it is not a conspiracy, but if you understand what I call justification, investment, and influence, and you lock people into particular institutions, hell, this is what, Foucault gets, and all the critical people get. Once you lock people into institutions and then they develop normative systems of justification, and then they're the power brokers, right? Exactly. I'm coming along having been sold on empiricism and then waking up and being like, actually, I was just sold a bowl of, there's some real brilliance here, but the systematic way of understanding it's all bullshit. What is that? Do you really think the power brokers that are now invested in full professors at all the Ivy League shit want to hear from me that basically, this is important, good stuff, but actually we all need to deconstruct and then reconstruct. Your foundation's fucked up. Nobody wants to hear that. I mean, not the textbooks people, not the full professors. So they just don't pay any fucking attention. And obviously if nobody cites, I mean, some people cite my shit, but it's like, there's no momentum, and how the hell are you going to leverage?
There's no impetus for it. There's
no impetus. Exactly. In fact, there's a lot of inertia resistance, dead weight resistance that finds it to be, that gets defensive about it and then just ignores it, and it doesn't need to, because I'm at an influence level. I'm just a little, fly. And I thought the system had more intellectual integrity. Like I was like, this is what we're about, right? Trying to figure out what truth is. People always saying we're interested in truth here. Well, actually, you're interested in justification, influence, investment, like fuckers. You're not really. If truth revealed you to be like, oh my God, you don't then stop what you're doing. You're like, I don't think that's really.
Totally. Well.
So anyway,
hard. Absolutely. I feel so much the same way. So how I've tried to approach the same thing is kind of this, or like this is my most recent sort of formulation, I guess, is so. Okay, so I studied a lot of the postmodern people, Deleuze, Foucault, a little bit of Derrida, Bourdieu, different sort of French theory people. But then I started to become interested in wanted to overcome that. I'm like, okay, let's go I don't know, beyond that sort of narrow thing. And so I became interested in its relationship to phenomenology and really understanding that really that French post-structuralism is really a kind of Heideggerian legacy. And they the big loss was basically moving towards Heidegger and forgetting Husserl, right? And so then I became really interested in going back to Husserl and studying his later work and what he was working on at the end of his life, especially with his assistant Eugen Fink, and what their vision of phenomenology was at the end, and eventually even trying to bring, like, you know, because Heidegger in some ways sort of betrayed Husserl or abandoned him, but even that, like, Fink was a student and friend of both of them, and they were trying to sort of bring things back together. And so there was this interest. There's a really good book about it called I think it's just Husserl and Fink. I'll send that to or whatever. Really interesting.
Can you give me a summary of what you extract as sort of the core of their insights around where their phenomenology landed? I mean, I'm familiar, but I'd love to hear your
so
synopsis of it.
So let's see. How can I sum it? Okay, so you have this tension between. Okay, so you have this. I guess I'll just explain it in this relationship between Husserl and Heidegger and how that tries to reconcile. So I see Husserl as being very much, even though I think it took him a little bit later to realize this, of being very, very, very Kantian in his essence, right? In that he's looking for the foundations of knowledge whatsoever. He's starting with, it's not only the Kantian line, but especially Descartes, trying to start with the fundamental doubt, and then try to work at the most basic like facts of experience, and then slowly build that system until you get the most basic ontology that you can have, that doesn't really speak of any sort of explanation or belief about the nature of reality at all, but you're trying to sort of start to articulate the furniture of everyday experience, right? So, but then what Husserl does in the more traditional way is he's what I call the theoretical, the theoria pole, more than the practical pole in some ways, although he still has that. So that his heights is this transcendental idealism. Eventually he calls what he's doing transcendental idealism, just like Kant. And what he's doing is, and doing what Plato was doing, which is the reflexive study of not the world as it is and the things within it, but the thing that experiences the world. And then that, which is really proper psychology, right, in a way, right? Where the attention to what could sort of be called the ego or the I eventually, or the self, is something that I become more interested in, that word.
John and I are doing a series on the self coming up.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in.
We can dialogue about that, but
and what they're interested in is the transcendental conditions of possibility for consciousness, experience, etc., altogether, right? So now you can go to this Kantian critique of pure reason limit, where you're not only critiquing empiricism or the limits of empirical understanding, which is mediated by the mind or the psyche, we'll say, but then also critiquing sort of like super psychic or even fundamental psychology itself, because he makes this articulation that the psyche and God, or the soul and God, are, because they're transcendental to experience, they're not really knowable because they're beyond it in a way, or they're that which makes it possible. But then, of course, with Hegel and Schelling and some other, and Fichte, they kind of go back to Plato, which says, no, like, yes, kind of, that's true, but there's ways in which we can start to find this link between true depth psychology, or the understanding of nous, or mind, and relate that to our concept of God and the spiritual, right? And so, but then
unified theory does all that, by the way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's what.
And we can dialogue about that, but that's great. Love it.
And,
Yeah, go ahead.
and then, but what Heidegger emphasizes, right? So Heidegger's famous for saying, no, let's stop doing that. That's metaphysics. That's disembodied. That's old philosophy. Let's get rid of that. Let's start again, influenced by Nietzsche.
Yep.
And then what he focuses on is still phenomenology, but mainly concerned with the worldly being, what it's like to be here. And he's influenced a lot by, of course, the pragmatists. Yep. and others. And really what I would describe what Heidegger does. So I would say what Husserl does is true psychology. What Heidegger starts to do is actually the psyche seems to sort of be muted in a way. And what he's really concerned is the ethos of ethology, right? He's doing ethology, which is being in the world, action, or the totality of action, right, and your relationship to one's environment.
Yes.
And so that's where I then start to build. So you have this reflexive, transcendental direction of the sciences, which is metaphysics, starting from phenomenology backwards, right? But then the praxeological, or that's what we call, or the ethological, is thinking about the worldly engaged relationship. And then that's where I relate it to the relationship between ethology and ecology.
Nice.
And how that these things are totally interdependent in terms of actor and world. And then also within that, I try to build off this ethnology out of ecology and things like that. And so that's where I think I want to talk about that too, because then that actually ends up being in an attempt to have a fundamental praxeology or practical ontology. You not only get the foundation for an actual practical or ethical philosophy, but also you get the ontology for understanding the categorization of the sciences themselves as human practices.
Totally.
So, anyways, but that's getting more into something different. But so Eugene Fink was trying to put these things together and say, how do we have this thing as a whole? And, but then also like a little bit like, they were really trying to work on sort of counter to Heidegger, the most concise way to build that ontology and to kind of build that journey or whatever. So that gets a little bit more meticulous. But what was really interesting is that it seemed that Husserl and Fink were actually towards the end of their lives starting to build what they kind of called a meontology, but it's kind of confusing what that means, but it's almost like they were trying to reach beyond being towards non-being. But I think what that really started meant, and what the author, Rosina or whatever, I'll send it to you, was sort of showing is that there's this way, and this is an idea that has just I've just locked onto, is a way to relate phenomenology to the Neoplatonic tradition. And sort of because that, with the Neoplatonic tradition, you have the transcendental reflexive theoria, and then you have the preoccupation with praxis in the world, which is the this the Heideggerian thing, but and then in this relationship between theurgy and things like that. And so basically I'm in this project of wanting to go back to Husserl as like a guide to figure out how to be the most meticulous and almost mathematical in building the very foundations, which start not with the most transcendent or the most empirical, but start what I considered this like middle point, the point where heaven and earth meet, which is our everyday experience, right?
Yep.
And then from that point you can decide, whether you start to where your point of analysis is.
So a really cool thing might be if I can teach you the unified theory.
Please.
Okay? And then if you learn the unified theory, then here's a prediction. All right. If I hand you the cognitive gadgets that make up the unified theory, this is what my experience is. And the people that, I'll say this, I mean, I do speak it just qualitatively different than other people. Yeah. I built it, but people are starting to see that when they put on the lens of the unified theory, it's a theory of knowledge, okay, which includes reality and the knower. Right. And the knowledge systems that knowers have generated about reality.
Right.
So And so what it does is it basically then says, oh, I put these glasses on, this category system for sorting, and this descriptive system for the mechanisms in their interface and relation, my relation to myself in the cosmic coordinates. It's got all that, okay? Then you should be able to go back from a systemic perspective and say, hey, I'm tracking a particular kind of systemic conciliant, you, okay? And the intersections that you see, we should be able to then align in very, very readily with the language of the unified theory, which is totally different. I didn't come out of Husserl or any of that, but I should be able to come back and basically, oh, boom.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and if that's the case, then we actually, so what the whole problem of metasystemic thinking has been that you can't connect all the dots. No one's even been fucking close to connecting all the dots. Okay? And then it breaks up. It's like, well, I mean, I got a lot of fucking dots here down. You know, and then once you have a lot of dots with a core, then actually there is a way to justify why this system is better than all the other systems qualitatively. And if that's the case, then you'll actually leverage. If enough people say, well, it is qualitatively different, and they say why in the same language, then you have public consensual knowledge, and then that will leverage the damn system.
Yeah. Interesting. Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think there's an like my one, after a certain point, my personal imperative or whatever was just this kind of ecumenical research work where it's like, refuse this culture and academics of let's show why this thinker's better than another or something. Say, no. Realize the more important pattern is that philosophy and the sciences are a whole.
Totally.
And then from that point, then we have to do the meticulous work of how do we basically unify, how do we just take all of that work and synthesize it? And so I think for me, it's like, I'm basically wanting to synthesize the best of sort of French post-structural stuff and some other things at that same time, bring it back in line with the major phenomenological writers, Searle, Heidegger, Levinas, Henri, different sort of people. Then another thing that's really related to that is philosophical anthropology, like, you know, Max Scheler or Ernst Cassirer, you know, these guys. So they're really influential on me. Synthesize that with what came before that, which is really interesting, is this neo-Kantianism that really builds this bridge between German idealism and Kantianism and phenomenology. But then also in that middle point, you have the developments of psychology and anthropology, and then synthesize that with the German idealist, and then go back, and then we need to integrate Spinoza, Leibniz, and Descartes together. And now you have basically all of modern philosophy. And now the jump is, how do you reconcile that with basically Neoplatonic humanism and the ancient philosophy? And so then there's this process and Christian theology and Islamic theology and other sorts of theologies. And I mean, this is, like we say, it's this integral or consilience or harmonic or sort of process,
right? So there's a couple of things here that I think are really, I mean, super resonant, very good. I'm glad we got a chance to connect, and I look forward to exploring this even further. So I'm psyched. That's cool. So, all right, a couple of things. One is the sensibility. Two points on the sensibility of what we are. Okay, what's our culture here? So, one, do you know Stephen Pepper's work on worldview, metaphysics, worldview?
No, never heard.
1942. My blanket. It's a great book. It's on the he argues, he lays out 6 different metaphysics. Okay, 2 of which he thinks are completely inadequate, and 4 of which he thinks are reasonable. Okay, and it's useful to know these. So one is naive realism, common sense. Okay, well, that's no good. And then he jumps into refined knowledge, which means I'm systematically thinking about that. That's good. There's one kind of refined knowledge that he rejects, which is which is fundamental skepticism. We don't know anything. That is a refined knowledge on naive realism, but it's not meaningful. Okay. Then he argues that there are 4 major sort of metaphysical, really I would call them metaphysical epistemological worldviews, although he emphasizes metaphysics, but it's really a metaphysical epistemological intersection. One of which is formism, the Platonic formism view, and archetypally mathematics and the pure form relations and how that works. The second is mechanism, which is archetypally Newtonian in its orientation in terms of, hey, cause effect and things work like a clock. Okay? Then there's the organicity, what he calls, which is us. Okay, these are the systematic individuals that put things in systems. Okay. And then there are the contextualists, which are basically postmodern kind of thinkers, which are basically like, okay, everything has to be embedded in context and understanding.
Or culture theory in general,
Culture theory in general. And I always argued that, the nice thing about the unified theory and its various dimensions of complexity and its theory of knowledge is that it can explain and coordinate all of those. And at the same time, certainly the emphasis is this organicity. It's systematic, systems theory, general systems theory, all of these kinds of things, which is fundamentally underdeveloped in the academy. Okay, the academy mostly emphasizes mechanism, and now recently contextualism, and its history, and of course the long history is formism. But we basically adopt natural science. Basically takes Aristotle over, although there are a lot of mathematicians out there like Max Tegmark and things like that are formists in heart. Anyway. So one thing to think about is, yes, the systemic organistic kind of way is a particular way of being oriented toward metaphysics and epistemology. And all of us that do conciliant systemic work generally, coherence is our primary, and that certainly resonates with me. I want coherence. Okay? Rather than mechanisms tends to be a scientific correspondence principle, which but then it narrows and it loses sight of the big picture. So that's one point. Then we come up. And the second point I wanted to say was that the attitude we're trying to cultivate here is a meta-modern integrated pluralism. Okay. So you already basically identified integrated pluralism. Okay. Meaning that integrative means it's differentiated and connected, and you're oriented toward that. And pluralism means there's a lot of different ways to slice that fucking pie. Multiplicity. It comes very consistent with an organismic systems view. Obviously, it's a big thing. We have to see how it goes together, and you can look at it from lots of different directions. And usually then you're oriented toward what I call the weak versions of people's versions of reality, meaning that you're seeing something that's partially true, but it ain't, this is the integral does a lot of this. It's both and it's partially true, but not fully true, and blah, blah, blah. So that's one sensibility. The second sensibility, meta-modern. Have you seen much on meta? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of been the interesting thing. Integral theory, I've seen a lot, and then a lot of meta-modern, which is interesting. And then, but I think I'm less versed in articulating what that means. But it's interesting because I think it's again the same thing that I've kind of a part of, because ultimately what we're talking about is these are always already conciliant emerging events of culture and consciousness happening. So it is the same. But when I was doing early anthropology at the university, I was really interested in this idea of postmodern anthropology. And now that means something a little bit different. But at the time, in some ways, what's funny is like the way they were talking about postmodernism in like the early or the mid 80s or something, just in these very small writings, it's essentially kind of metamodernism, which, because it's really this like, the meaning of it at that time was, let's find an anthropology or just whatever, that actually leads us out of modernity into something different, which I think is what metamodernism.
So the postmodern view, so here's the way I make sense of the shorthand, which I think is very reasonable and a nice heuristic. There are 4 prior sensibilities, okay? And what the metamodern view is going to do is going to, in a very Wilberian sense, you're going to include and transcend each of these. Unlike Wilber, who then puts them on the rainbow of sort of does this culture consciousness statement, okay? I'm very reticent, although I see it, I get it, I think it's good. I don't encourage, at least from a theory of knowledge perspective, us to be like second tier consciousness, okay? That's Wilber's, like you go through these things and then you get up to green, which is postmodernism, and then you make a jump into the teal, and that's second tier, and you're just And what he's trying to say is that you actually are transcending and then including, whereas each one of these is sort of like you're fixed in. And so it is a different relation, but it also means like, oh, I'm second tier and you're just first tier, which is from an ego perspective is fucking disaster. I mean, people are like, fuck you, and I'll try to climb and blah, blah, blah. So for me,
when there's too many colors and shapes, when there's too many colors and shapes, spirals, you get a little suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually really, this is much, it aligns with that, and it includes, basically includes that. It gets out of the ego and says basically the evolution of what I call mind three. I have a different ways of talking about mind, but I have a map of mind. Mind three refers to the talking, justifying mind at my level. And that's what interfaces with the culture or ideologies of justification systems writ large. So that's the plug-in. Okay. So there have been different human mind culture phases. The first is oral indigenous. Okay?
Yeah.
So from starting 100,000 years ago, certainly by 50,000 years ago, we're full talking to each other and have building systems of propositional justificatory narratives about how the fucking world works. And this is going to then give rise to the first, ideologies, animistic ideologies, ways of being, and cultures that are embedded. And then for 50,000 years, we're on this oral indigenous way of being in the world. Which cultivates because of what it emphasizes, talking to each other, embodiment in nature, living in close clans with hardship in particular ways. It is a particular kind of sensibility, okay? And the value of what it does, we really need to remember a lot of what the oral indigenous people had, because they need to teach us about relation and relation to nature fundamentally, and the need for face-to-face connection and narrative, okay? And so that's one. Then you get civilization, you get agriculture, building of cities and writing, okay, basically. And then you get the explosion of two great ages of traditional and then philosophical thought. One Bronze Age shit in the earliest tradition of Zoroastrianism, okay? Then you get an axial age explosion, an axial age explosion, like 800 BC, okay? Totally. Which then gives rise to most of the great religions and philosophy are coming off the Greeks. All right. And so this is the traditional formal, and it is required because you need individuals to live in cities. You need a different kind of way of thinking.
Right.
It also separates.
It affords a way of thinking.
It affords both. Right. And Marshall McLuhan would talk about how tech tools, we build tools to change the world, and then the tools change us. Okay. Right. And civilization now creates a bubble around us. So now nature is separate. We're above and separate from. The writing now changes the dynamics of justification. Civilization allows for a lot more reflective thought. And we basically, and you can see this most clearly like in the Greek tradition, and it's most of what I'm versed in. What happens then is you get what I call analytic justification. Okay. Systematic, what you discover math and the truth of math. The Pythagoreans do this. And then, so they have what I would call, this is really the first transcendent idealist kinds of notions. So like, oh my God, they're truth independent, okay, of what we're bullshitting about. Okay. And Socrates really captures this. In fact, epistemology, Socrates essentially discovers, or at least in our lineage, formal epistemology, okay, which is, oh my God, everybody's engaged in pragmatic social justification, okay, but they may just be bullshit. So the Socratic method is, hey, tell me who you are and what you believe and what you get the justification all out, and then you're like, no, this isn't true, this is inconsistent, and you're like, oh God, what really is true? And he's wise because he knows nothing. What that means is he's discovered the social pragmatic aspect of justification that people were taking to be as true, but was really contextual in all this, and then you get Plato and Aristotle coming off of that to give us our two foundational ontological, initial in the West, our great ontological debate between formism and substance.
Right.
But at the sensibility level, now you have capacity for abstraction, large-scale thinking, beliefs in nation states, religions, identities. Okay. And this is our heritage. We want to be grounded in certain civilizations. It matters that I'm an American psychologist. I'm anchored in a particular tradition.
Right.
Okay? So that's traditionalism. And we have to, and from a meta-modern perspective, there's a lot of value there and need and wisdom.
Yeah.
Then you get modern science. So modern science and the Enlightenment shift into capitalism, into individualism, into progress, into globalization. and democracies and all that. And then you, in the Industrial Revolution and capital, labor relations, and everything else changes and creates this global system. Okay?
Right. Hey, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna plug in my charger real quick. So,
sure.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay. So then you get this global system of justification. And then, of course, because of the one side of the Enlightenment gap is society and science is trouble, and what are our knowledge systems? And Nietzsche's really the first postmodernist, and he critiques the justification of any of these fucking systems from particular wings. And ultimately, then in the last 50 years, we've gotten the resurgence, both socially and philosophically, of the postmodern critique.
Right.
Okay? That coherent knowledge of enlightenment that leads to progress is basically bullshit for a whole host of reasons. And we have to give up the grand meta narrative and re-examine what are the marginalized voices, as opposed to white male colonial cisgendered people that are, dominating the version of reality. Okay.
Yes.
So this is a care about who's marginalized, a care about the planet, a concern about the globalized, white male dominance and hegemony. And so the meta-modern view basically says, hey, 50,000 years ago, this happened. Okay? 5,000 years ago, this happened. 500 years ago, this happened. 50 years ago, this happened. So it's a nice sort of like, And then I like to say 5 years from now, 5 years from now, meaning we're not there yet. But right now, what is happening is there's an awakening to a meta-modern sensibility. Okay? And the institutions were built, the blue church institutions are built on modernism. Postmodernism showed it wasn't going to work. Okay. And then the digital shattered all of the structure. So right now we're in chaotic flux. So now we've swallowed the postmodern reality, so nobody knows anything. And now if you become unmoored in that way, and then there'll be totalitarian ideologies that will try to come along and tell you, because you have to have some justification system that people work on, and that's the great fear and the great challenge of our day, okay, is to create a meta-modern, integrated, pluralistic sensibility, that does justice to the enormous diversity and at the same time has coherence, okay, that allows people to plug in at an integrated, pluralistic way that gives enough coherence, that holds and has enough flexibility and variation in it and is true enough to the system and its uniqueness that it can hold the subject and objective knowledge and intersubjective constructions of knowledge all together. That's if we get a system that actually holds through all of the perspectival clashing and freedoms that people have, then we can coalesce, and then the system has the nice order, chaos balance, and does complex adaptive things going forward, and allows us to thread the needle through the digital virtual and our relationship with the planet, so that we don't Titanic ourselves into a fucking iceberg and kill everything.
Exactly, which is this exactly thread through the needle or a razor's edge task or whatever, to where how do we take the best of what we've come to know as science. And I think for me, that means starting to emphasize again, as it was before, the sort of more rationalist end rather than the purely empiricist end, right? But which just means something that is durable to any kind of doubt, right? So we're retaining the best of the Enlightenment, or the radical Enlightenment, which is it's not just about putting the full set of doubt of religious ideology, but also, and almost more importantly now, scientific ideology or positivist ideology, but eventually unifying the best of still retaining an empirical project, but in its proper place as being secondary to a larger ethical project of science.
So the yellow flower back there, I mean, I have one that I'll walk you through the whole thing. So the yellow flower in the middle of the tree, okay, is actually, I'll bring it up. We can share. I'll share my screen real fast here. Garden one here. this one.
Beautiful.
Okay. Okay. So this flower right here.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a yin yang symbol.
Yep.
All right. And it means, all these things mean lots of different things. Okay.
Right.
So the M stands for metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
And the E stands for empirical.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So what this is about fundamentally is about a conciliant metaphysics, which means what are our concepts and categories that we use to understand. Then that goes right into rationalism. Okay. The concepts and categories. And Kant said, hey, concepts without percepts are blind, and percepts without concepts are confused. I don't remember exactly what he said, but basically percepts is empiricism, meaning through the senses to see. Okay. And by the way, empiricism has two fucking meanings that we get confused with. There is the original meaning is first person empiricism, like qualitative.
Yeah.
Okay? That's the original meaning of the empiricist, like Hume and Locke.
Yeah.
First person.
Radical empiricism, maybe.
Right. Well, then it becomes the radical empiricism.
But it has to say that, right? Because it's
it became radical because then it was trying to return. What happens then with the scientific method through physics, empiricism then basically eliminates the quality knower. So all the quantification and the experimental method is all about getting it out of the head and getting it into third-person public knowledge of the behavioral changes.
Forgetting the observer. Yeah.
Right. That's really so. The first-person empiricism is the task of phenomenology, basically, in many ways. I mean, it's like starting at least with the brain. Third person is behavior, and in its raw form, initial form, it basically eliminates this subjective observer, and that's been a horrible confusion. And then metaphysics. So Galileo comes along. At the time of Galileo, what you had is a resurgence of scholastic metaphysics. The Renaissance had happened, and then there was a scholarship, and then they were trying to do Aristotle. They discovered some more stuff about Aristotle, but then it was sort of Aristotle gone wild, girls gone wild. Everything was crazy, woohoo! And then they were just trying to talk about the telos of everything. Okay, so everything was, if you took I think somebody said, if you took heroin or whatever, something that made you sleepy, it was because the essence of that drug is sleepiness, and that's what it wanted to resolve itself. So it's just stupidly tautological. And Galileo was brilliant, and he was pissed about that. And so he ended up hating Aristotle's metaphysics and was totally focused on Aristotle's errors. And so what he then does is basically makes the move to eschew metaphysics and approach the natural world through a third-person empiricism and a matter in motion, so that his empiricism mapped his metaphysics, meaning that he could just see what the hell he was talking about. But that was disastrous, because then natural science then decided that just like Heidegger tried to get rid of metaphysics and philosophy, the natural science people got rid of metaphysics at this juncture with Galileo, and they always then have. And what I realized in psychology was, through the Enlightenment gap, was my field is completely metaphysically confused about mind and behavior. It has no idea what it means by mental processes or behavioral processes in relation. Okay, so ultimately the solution of the unified theory, similar to Kant's rational empirical synthesis, is really a metaphysical empirical synthesis. Okay, and recognizing those different domains both dialectically and a continuum. And then what this basically means is that there's a big picture view here. Okay, and this is, by the way, a symbol of integrative pluralism, because what each one of these little flowers is a you and me, and it represents the individual. So you have a metaphysics, that's your justificatory way of making sense. You have an empirical experience of the world, your first person experience of being. Okay, and the issue is, how do we connect the pluralistic individuals with the larger picture? Okay, that's an integrative pluralistic view. And by the way, it also spells meme, M-E-M-E, so that then you can say, hey, actually what we need to do is a mimetic challenge of cultural evolution. We need to create a system of force, social force, that allows this ideology to be retained and spread and grow. So that's what the center flower there means.
Great. Oh, let me
I can bring it back.
Great. One joke comment was, I don't know if you've heard Deleuze or not, but his eschewing of arborealism and trying to get the rhizomatic or whatever. But now I'm happy to see the return of the trees because we need that. We need the trunk.
Right. Vines are all through this thing. Okay. So rhizomatic vines are all through this fucking thing. And in each individual, we have rhizomatic vine pluralism completely.
Right.
Okay. Right. But it isn't just, if it were simply a tangle of individualized chaos with no balance of order, it would be that. You know, so there are jungles and there are pictures of the jungle. You know, there's the outline of the jungle.
Absolutely.
So the Deleuzian thing is, that's the postmodern kind of critique, which is great, but ultimately it's always the dialectic between the uniqueness, the divergence, all of the chaos versus versus order. And then we need the proper framing of order and chaos that allows for sense making.
Yeah. Well, what's important, especially with trying to rectify the postmodern thing in a proper way, which is to identify its strengths and and the best of it, but trying to show what it's afraid of, it ought not to be afraid of, which is that the true tradition of the transcendental, which they're trying to overcome in favor of absolute immanence, that the tradition is to understand the transcendental to be immanent within every single thing, especially, anyways, but with the spiral, I want to show or tell you my sort of a version of that, which is kind of like almost like first principles of the sciences, which then categorizes the sciences in some ways, or in some ways, the fundamental ontology of objects. If you could break it down into 2 or 3 or whatever, that then is the framework for the sciences, because sciences study certain kinds of objects, right? Or not objects, whatever. But so what's interesting is, at first I started with what I would just start a theory and praxis, and what I kind of just had explained earlier, and this sort of theory of metaphysical stuff, and then so almost like metaphysics, which kind of includes, like, psychology is like the hallway of metaphysics. You kind of start there, get deeper into the self, and that leads the way into metaphysics. And then the other way is as the psyche, being the actor that produces behavior, is then has the landscape of activity, and those are the practical sciences, right? Sure. But then I started to say, well, try to add another element, and this came out of reading Hegel, or going back to Hegel a little bit and trying to see how he divided his system. Okay. And I'm not sure about this, and this is why it's fun to talk to someone that's doing this same thing, or he had, what was it? So he had the philosophy of logic, philosophy of, what did he call it? Nature, and philosophy of spirit, right? And that kind of corresponds with the old Stoic tripartite division of the sciences or philosophy into logic, ethics, and physics. So then I'm like, what does that mean? Is that valuable at all? But what I started to realize is that for logic really ends up being just the study of the mind, really. And so in some ways, if we see logic, and I think there's evidence for this, that really what they meant would be kind of what we're talking about in terms of that phenomenological, reflexive, transcendental metaphysics or whatever. Okay. And then ethics is our practical analysis, but then physics is something different. I was trying to chew on this a little bit and trying to figure out how I can make sense of this, because for the moment, my praxeology was sort of responsible for all the sort of the worldly dimension or engaged dimension. But then I started to realize that I think what is possible is there's a difference between, I start to divide it so that there's sort of like 3, and it's not a perfect trinity, but there's if we divide things into, say, phenomenopsychology or something, which is like the recursive or the reflexive one, and then praxeology, which is of action, but then physiology or physics, which is sort of the Aristotelian study of nature in that sense. So that's the true natural philosophy, which is different than ethical philosophy, is that they actually represent, one, the active force of the psyche, and then the passive force, which is the active force is what I do in the world, but the other is how the world impresses itself upon me. So in some ways, in certain activities or certain sciences, in the most general sense, so even like something like baking or ceramic making or engineering or something like that, that things can go towards the pole of the practical, to where there may be very little cessation of engaged activity and more open passiveness to the empiricism, because that's what's ultimately required, is that to have the real natural philosopher and eventually the empiricist, phenomenologically, you need an attitude of disengagement, because you're not busy trying to do something and manipulate something. It's that. So in some ways, I start to try to
I can that's a, so here's how I would
how do you relate to things?
So all right, so there's the natural into social sciences. Okay, so this would be what physics probably would be, and the Aristotle's concerns. Okay, and what that is that I am a scientist, so I'm going to now, which means I'm going to take myself as an observer,
right?
I'm going to place myself as an independent observer, and I'm going to have now the objects of the world, okay, as my object of study, and then the tree of knowledge then depicts one what I would argue to be the best map of those things. Okay?
Right.
And it places so science is, you know what the tree, you have the tree of knowledge in your head. So it's the science as on one side, and then you have the reality, ontic reality that I'm trying to model, which is matter, life, mind, and culture.
Yes.
Okay? Now, I just did a blog on this. There's a fundamental distinction, okay, but in relation to the observer and observed, between physics, there's one relation there,
right?
Biology, psychology, basic, animal, which is basically ethology and comparative psychology. I mean, those things are like, okay, and then into the social sciences, okay? So the epistemological, ontological, ontic reality relation into the social sciences now gets very, very, because there's a recursive feedback loop that's much more intimate and direct.
Yes.
Okay? And Tony Giddens calls this the double hermeneutic. All right. So anyway, what I would hear with Hegel is when he starts talking spirit, okay, and Geist in the spirit and an absolute spirit, all right.
Yeah.
He's in really the social sciences and tracking the idea that, okay, wait a minute, as we say what it is, and are we moving toward absolute spirit, and what's happening, the feedback loop between knower and known up here in the social sciences, that's crazy different than the natural world. That's why we do need this distinction, right?
Yeah.
But it's not, you can still describe it and not necessarily be doing ethics. Okay, so there's that interrelation. And my experience between being a psychological scientist and my primary training is a clinician. Okay, this is where this gets me, this is how I have this allowed myself to see this. Okay. So now you have physics into ultimately spirit, but where did physics ultimately come from? Like, how were we able to have the philosophical architecture to enable us to start to delineate the logic of nature? Logic. Okay. The mathematical forms that we stumbled across in analytic philosophy. So for me, what you get is refined knowledge starts the game, okay, at least in the West. All right. And math provides an archetypal, and math and logic are closely intertwined. And some people call this the formal science. I prefer not to call them the formal science, but I call them logic and mathematics. Right? As a particular branch of philosophy. All right. That is using experience, but then creating transcendent ideas through deductive truth claims, like the Pythagorean theorem, most classically. It's like that's fucking true. We discovered that or created that. It's hard to know, but it is true. If you say that it's not true, I don't give a shit, because we can demonstrate that there is at least some profound transcendent truth in the math. Okay. And then those become the psychotechnology, use John's word. All right, that we then start to show that nature speaks the language of mathematics. And of course, that's what becomes physics into the natural sciences. Right. But then this weird relation between once you get up to humans and self-reflecting recursive
Yes.
elements, right? Then everything starts to get weird. Okay?
Right.
So for me, what I did was we're missing the natural into social science system of knowing that's conciliant. And psychology was at the fundamental root because it has its roots in natural science. Okay, meaning I can study, what the hell ants are doing and how they're getting together from a comparative psychology perspective. That, of course, as I justify what they're doing, doesn't make any difference. They still do what they do, And then I come up into primates, and then I come up into persons, of course, at the base of the social sciences. And psychology never understood that actually, because it bridges from animal to human, it bridges natural into social. And how the fuck does it actually deal with this recursive feedback loop? It's on the bridge. The unified theory says you break basic psychology, make it akin to ethology and behavioral science, all that shit. And then you have human psychology, which is at the base of the social sciences. And it has to deal with this recursive feedback loop of claiming what spirit is, and then impacting spirit accordingly, which is a very complicated philosophy.
Yeah, well, that's what was interesting about, because I was really interested in reading the philosophy of spirit, and it was the one he didn't really finish as much as he did the others, supposedly. But what's interesting in there, if you look at the sections, on one hand, in that later volume or whatever, it's I forget the place of phenomenology, but the point is it's still importantly related because it's the phenomenology of spirit. But within the philosophy of spirit, there's this, how he starts to develop it is, let me try to think, is basically it's so confusing because he starts with anthropology, but what he's really talking about seems to be, to me, the soul as the basis. And then from that, he builds on that to describe, eventually he says the psyche comes out of that, but then he's almost sort of not clarifying the relationship between psyche and Geist. And it's confusing, like what his, because eventually my theory that for Geist is what I think we would just call ethos, or the active live, the player, that's playing the whole thing, and the presence of the divine that acts in the world. But then from action, a theory of action, then he builds his social science, which is actually then what we think of as anthropology, even though he's called it anthropology to begin with. And then, it's all pretty strange, but it would be interesting to kind of play with that. But I think the other thing with, there's an interesting relationship between phenomenology and physiology. This is like something Heidegger played with, which is, phenomenology is to, experience my pen. And so the same thing's happening. It's, the unity of being and whatever. But then when I choose to go in one mode, one is, I guess, the first person, which is to think about the pen not as whatever it is in and of itself, basically what it is for me. And I'm observing it as phenomenon, not as a third person phenomenon. But where physis and phenomenos, or phenomena or something, have an etymological relationship. And so that really, it's almost like changing the mode to where now to mute the first person, say, okay, now let's just observe it and wait for it understanding it is always my representation of it, but I'm almost like listening for its perturbations or its realness in some ways. And that is like the phenomenological experience of real empiricism, if that makes sense. But then the other thing is the relationship between physis and praxis is that, again, they're sort of like the mirrors of each other, because especially, this is clear on the human level, it becomes obscured when you start to think of what we call the inanimate. But my talking, what I call from the interior perspective of me doing it, I understand it as my praxis, my action, what the psyche that is different from the body is creating a form. and creating the action. But then whether I'm looking at the mirror or you're watching me from the third person, the action from the exterior as kinesis in the physical realm is then the exterior of what I call action. So in some ways, praxeology is the interior worldly, is the imminent manifesting active activities of the psyche from the interior.
Totally.
And then it's important to then understand, this is where like Leibniz becomes important, is then when we look at like what I would call a heteroethology, or studying the behavior of someone else, is you don't really study, that's a little bit more complicated, but studying their physicality, which includes what they're saying and their activity. But you can only study that. That's and you never see the psyche, you only intuit it, right? Or you only intuit that it is.
This is where all my stuff works. Okay, so there's the thing that I developed to make this concrete. So all what you said is exactly right. And when I say nobody knows what the fuck psychology means, there's no systematic, metaphysical, coherent system of the inside-outside behavior and phenomenological views. Okay.
Right.
And so that's crucial. And there are easy ways to make. Well, now they're available to us to put the puzzle pieces together, so that I can have inside-outside, dual aspect consilience between behavior. So the scientist perspective is behavior. All right. And nowadays with our Zoom, you and I are recording our Zoom, right? So now we have an objective measurement of our behavior. And so that's a third person, to use integral terms. This is upper right. Okay. So we're going to look at each one of us, and then I can have a behavioral. Now, integral makes a mistake. Okay. Integral puts this is where he, in my opinion, and I think this is really clear, he does. He treats upper right like Watson treats it, because he treats it as if it's physical. Okay. That's wrong. That's not, it's behavioral, but there's a radical difference between behavior and physical.
I'd like to probe you on that a little. That's interesting, but we'll leverage from that. Keep going. Yeah, please.
But you know it right now, because what you are perceiving me physicality wise, but you have a cognitive lens that allows you to track the thing that really matters, okay, is my mental behavior, which is my embodiment, okay, and our shared implicit intersubjectivity, which is like, hey, does my perspectival and participatory knowing sync up with yours, and are we dancing together non-verbally? That's perspectival and participatory, to use John Vervaeke's language, okay? And you track that behavior as a human. And the second thing that you track is my propositional justificatory behaviors.
Right. Okay. That's within it, right?
That's what your system, the relevance realization of your cognitive architecture is tracking those forms.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
That's what you're tracking on the inside. Okay. Yeah. And the categories of forms, yes, they live in the physical universe, because everything does, including your physiology. You're in, from my vantage point, the subjectivity somehow is a neurobiological electromagnetic field that, we're still confused about exactly how it gets unity, but we're coming close. I mean, I think we're at least at the level of understanding the basic metaphysics of functional form. In fact, I'm just wrapping up my chapter right now on subjective conscious experience, what I call mind two. Okay. So mind two is is the part that is your what I call your epistemological portal into the world. So you fall asleep, that goes offline. You wake up, and your epistemological portal of mind two comes online. And this is the gap between behavior and phenomenology, is you can never see another person's first person experience. Okay. And it's, in fact, this is a great question, whether it's even impossible in theory to see somebody's. And that's a big, interesting issue. But certainly in practice, almost all the time, you're contained inside your portal, okay? And that doesn't have access.
Right.
But it's wrong we do not want to identify that as the mind in its totality. Okay, that's a big mistake. Okay.
Sorry, what?
That's just mind two. The thing that's behind your eyes that you can't see, That's a domain of the mental, but not all of it.
So
okay?
how else could we say that, or how else could you typify that? And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go.
Yeah,
and
we gotta go. Yeah.
I gotta go to work, but
No doubt. I'll send you a few blogs, and we can. There's a thing called a map of. So here, I'll end on this point, okay?
Yeah.
Because there are lots of different problems in psychology, but the fundamental core problem is the subject matter problem. Like, what is psychology about? Okay.
Right.
The definition of psychology in textbooks is a science of behavior and mental processing. 80-90% of the texts, that's where we landed on.
Yeah.
Okay. You have to then separate behavior is what is epistemologically accessible. Okay. Well, actually, you got to divide behavior first as what's scientifically accessible.
Right.
And then this mind as behavior is mental behavior. That's what you can see from the outside. Okay.
Yeah.
Then there are three kinds of mental processes. All right. One is neurocognitive functionalism. Okay. That's your nervous system, which is the function of your nervous system. Why the fuck do you have it? Is it's an information processing computational control system. That's what it is. And it's mostly non-conscious. Okay. All right. So it's non-conscious first. And, shit like insects. We don't know whether insects have any subjective experience of being or not. That's a big question. And some people say yes, some people say no, and we really don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I believe that that's just when mind 2 with insects is starting to come online. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's called the early hypothesis of subjective conscious experience. Some people have a late hypothesis. All right. Yeah. And I have an idea. But then mind 2 starts. I believe mind 2 starts with pleasure and pain as coordinating systems to move the body, approach, and forward. Okay. That's where it starts. And then what you get with higher animals, birds and mammals, okay, is what happens is as it broadcasts, then it gets consolidated into perceived inner mind's eye, and then you get working memory, and then you get deliberation, and then you get all the things that higher animals can do. Okay, so that's a two-step process, but both of those are the elements, the two steps of subjective conscious experience of being. A pleasure-pain base that coordinates learning, and then perspectival knowing and participatory knowing come online, so you get an inner mind's eye. That's the root of phenomenology. But in every other animal, the subjectivity is only accessible through behavior.
Right.
However, with us, because of the nature of information interface, we can symbolically represent our subjectivity and tell you about it.
Right.
That goes right through the fucking skin. Okay. And so the medium of language, if I say a thought private to myself linguistically, and then I say it outside, the information content is identical.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's access, much more access to the mind, and the human mind in particular, behaviorally. I mean, it's just there it is. It goes right through the fucking skin. So so that's mind 3. Mind 3 is the talking mind. You have a private and a public version. Mind 1 is the neurocognitive information. There's mind 1A that's inside, and mind 1B, which is movement. And then you get mind 2. And I'm now arguing that there is a mind 2B, which is the intersubjective field of attention that we humans can share. So I can track you non-verbally and all that, but that's a whole other thing. But if you do mind 1, 2, 3, mind 1B out here, mind 1A, mind 2 inside, mind 3 as the narrator inside, that mind 3B, and then boom, you actually have a whole, then that's mind across the various domains. Right.
Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. I of course have so many more questions. And
well, we'll see. I'll send you this link, and I'll put you on the list, and we'll put this up on my. Are you okay with me putting this up on my little YouTube channel? I only have 50 subscribers.
Go for it. Let's talk soon. As soon as
we'll find another time. Great, really good to chat with you. Obviously, I've actually been looking for people in anthropology and phenomenology, so this is a beautiful connection as far as I'm concerned. Okay.
Likewise. All right. Well, you have a great day.
Yep. Take care.
Looking forward to talk again. All right.